With me today is attorney Zehava Gur, an expert in administrative and constitutional law. Hello, Zehava. Colonel Ophir Elkabetz, Chief Military Defense Counsel, who is simply covering the investigation of the former officials during a hearing in Tomer.
Yeah, it's just bizarre. Beyond the fact that she also filed petitions against State Comptroller Engelman, she's basically waging a battle against the State Comptroller, who was granted the authority, meaning he has the authority under the Basic Law to investigate events. And she's trying to undermine that, whether through the Supreme Court or through letters she sent, the latest of which was the letter sent yesterday on June 26th, in which she claims that the State Comptroller actually has no authority to investigate former officials, but only the audited body itself, not the organs of that body. In other words, if they served in the Army, like for example Herzi Halavai or Aaron Haliva who served in the Army, and there was a failure in everything that happened on October 7th, her claim is that she can't investigate them because they're no longer part of the system, and he can only investigate the body over which he has authority.
So, what you're saying is it's not just about former officials from before. Not just those who left in October, but really those who were there in the days, the ones who are truly responsible, those holding key positions, those can't be investigated because they're considered former. You can't
Investigate them because they're not in office and actually in practice. Of course, because basically what she's saying, in other words, is that they're immune, you can't investigate them, and great. So if an event like what happened on October 7th happens, the heavy responsibility falls right at his doorstep big time. On the head of the intelligence division, on Haliva, and she's basically giving him a kind of immunity. How?
Does she justify that legally?
She says it's about protecting their good name, they're no longer in service, and all sorts of things, no legal argument that could actually be considered reasonable. In other words, at the end of the day, once the powers were granted to the State Comptroller by the Basic Law, it's clear that the provisions of the Basic Law override any letter from someone who apparently has a personal interest in this matter. I see this as some kind of forces joining together, and their entire goal is basically to thwart the investigation of the events of October 7th, and it starts with the Attorney General, the State Attorney, and the former head of the Shin Bet, Ronan Bar. There is something that ultimately drives these people to oppose any move that could expose their own involvement. There were serious failures there. There were disgraces. There was a lack of professionalism. There was negligence. There were blunders. And all of these things are being covered up. Now, how many of these things will we still be able to investigate? I don't know, because it's likely that evidence was also tampered with along the way. And they're clinging to whatever they can as if their lives depend on it, so that certain things will be exposed one way or another. This whole system, or this whole campaign they're trying to run against investigating the events of October 7th, is completely hypocritical when they shout, State Commission of Inquiry. In other words, you shout for a State Commission of Inquiry, but actually sabotage the investigation of those most responsible.
You know, it's amazing, because I'm sure that if we did some general survey, doesn't matter if it's right or left, there would be a consensus that those who held key positions should be investigated on this matter. Even if it's the Prime Minister, even if it's Haliva, even if it's Herzi, and anyone else who held those positions. And it's like a topic that, you know, if you weren't here and we weren't bringing it up, it would just slip under the radar. Almost no one talks about it. The Chief Military Defense Attorney says that those who held the most significant key positions can't be investigated. It's impossible to investigate them.
You know, it's beyond immunity. It's just unimaginable. I mean, these are people who are really neck deep in failure. By the way, they even took responsibility. On the contrary, we're not trying to pin responsibility on them. That responsibility, they explicitly declared, I'm responsible, I'm stepping down. Same with Haliva, same with Herzi Halavai. What conduct is this that gives them a loophole they won't be investigated? So what happens in a State Commission of Inquiry? Will they be allowed to be questioned? We know what a state commission of inquiry is, who appoints it, and who heads it. In my opinion, and this is the step I was thinking of, it's to turn to the state comptroller and tell him you're not complying. Meaning these instructions, these guidelines, or this demand not to investigate the bodies that were an integral and significant part in the 7th to the 10th range, you're not complying, you investigate, because that's the way. You have rights under the basic law. Your authority comes from the basic law, and therefore no other entity can prevent you from investigating. That's what we're saying.
Has there been any response from the state comptroller on this matter?
As far as I know, nothing has been published. I assume he will respond, and if he does, it's likely he'll completely reject this idea, this absurd idea.
Basically, what's at the core of this is that, look, they took responsibility, they resigned, they finished their roles, they fulfilled their duty to the public in this matter.
If you're saying they can't be investigated, and on the other hand, the state comptroller has authority, then how does that add up? Meaning, if you don't want them to be investigated and he has the authority, how does that make sense? I mean, I haven't seen any justification, really no justification that supports such a move, beyond the fact that it's not logical, not reasonable, it's just unacceptable. I think this is where the bereaved families and the families of the hostages need to stand up and raise a huge outcry. Because they are the main and primary victims of this whole story, I think.
Do you think anyone counts them? Because you were just at the Zini trial and saw what happens with the bereaved families and the families of the hostages who think a bit differently, and the way they're treated in a Supreme Court, and the way they're treated everywhere. Do you think anyone is counting them?
No one is counting them, and unfortunately that's the situation. The people who have paid the heaviest and greatest prices, and I know some of them personally and know what they're going through. And I've represented them several times already in the Supreme Court. I think it's a disgrace to the country, a disgrace to those officials who time and again prove to be indifferent, hard-hearted, and not attentive to the citizens, not to the public. I'm not even talking, of course, about the bereaved parents. They deserve everything. But we're up against a system. I was at the Zini Supreme Court hearing last week.
I saw your impressive performance. On one hand, you stated things in the sharpest and most unequivocal way, and on the other hand, with a certain composure, you stood there and said what needed to be said. And I imagine there was also a lot of frustration there, coming and feeling that you against total indifference.
Yes, I hoped and wished that when I went to say these things, I was actually the voice of a public of millions of citizens who feel the same way. I can see from the reach that video had, from the responses, it got almost 100,000 views. There really is a public that feels the same way. I was there not out of some deliberate sense of mission, but at that moment, once I started speaking, I felt I needed to say what the public feels. It's not just how I feel, but millions of others who are frustrated, disappointed, hurting, and I think the Supreme Court has gone bankrupt. It no longer fulfills its role. The High Court, I almost said, of course, it no longer fulfills its role. It doesn't protect human rights, and we find ourselves in situations where you ask yourself, what's going on here? Where is the democracy? Where is our voice that isn't counted in the High Court? In the end, when we come to the High Court and encounter such indifference and lack of sensitivity and irrelevant responses like, you come and talk about the fact that we are a public that elected a government that has authority, so why should the Attorney General be in the High Court? Prevent the exercise of these powers and actually harm us because that's our choice. It's complicated, it's hard, and I think it's time to change the composition of the committee for appointing judges, to choose judges who really aren't so extreme in their agenda. And the narrative you get when you sit in the High Court and hear the judges and their comments, you just say it's rigged from the start. You know, it's already, the verdict is already written in advance.
My theory, from the past, is that just by bringing these things to light, by talking about what's happening with the chief military prosecutor here, and we're already exposing what's going on with the government's legal advisor, and what's happening with the military advocate general. People are now much more aware of the problems and what's going on with the Supreme Court, and I think that's already half the solution. Just the fact that the public knows much more now, compared to 3 years ago when people weren't really aware. The bereaved families, it should be said, are present at almost all the Supreme Court hearings, most of which are about petitions from terrorists and their families. They know this, but the public doesn't know it. And I think the fact that there's much more awareness today is already leading toward a solution.
No, I don't agree with you. It won't bring a solution, but what it does do is raise these issues to public awareness in a way that marks the beginning of a process. Meaning, if really, like you said, before we didn't know, we didn't hear, we didn't understand. They didn't publish. There's also the issue of publicity, that before things weren't in the media, there was no Channel 14, there was no Agali Israel, a good channel, which of course does a job.
By the way, you said there are over 100,000 views on your social networks, meaning people are exposed to things much more now, compared to, back when things were very, very specific and clear-cut. There were 2 channels
that would broadcast, and we saw the information they were giving out, probably in a biased way, and we weren't aware or knowledgeable enough to make comparisons. So,
doesn't this, in the end, lead to some kind of pressure to find a solution and make a change?
Even if it does, it's a process that will take years. It's not something, this change isn't going to happen in the next year or 2. I think all the systems, the entire law enforcement system, the whole judicial system need what you might call a complete overhaul. It's just like that, meaning we need to renew this whole concept, to change, to bring in new opinions, to diversify perspectives, because you come to the Supreme Court, and I say again, I come to the Supreme Court. They ask me why I keep going to the Supreme Court, even though it's a lost cause. So I say we don't have any other tools, meaning if I had another tool I could use, I definitely wouldn't be going to the Supreme Court. But I don't have tool. I still want to believe human rights are at forefront for Supreme Court justices, which hasn't been case lately. Maybe for presidents, maybe for terrorists, yes, that's true. But when a person comes, or even bereaved families, you can already see the attitude, you see how things are handled. Silencing. They're simply silencing in the Supreme Court. There's nothing to be done. That's what's happening. Many times things are being said and the judge cuts you off because he doesn't want to hear what you have to say about that party or about that issue. And this shouldn't happen in a courtroom. From the moment you let me speak and gave me the right to speak, I also have the right to express my opinion, even if you as a judge don't like what I have to say.
Yes.
That's not happening.
Do you see a direct connection between legal matters and security issues?
Yes. Specifically, I should elaborate that, as I previously mentioned, the vast majority of the petitions that the High Court is tasked with addressing and deliberating upon are directly concerned with individuals identified as terrorists and, quite significantly, their immediate and extended families. This particular aspect of the High Court's caseload is a profoundly disturbing reality that, when fully comprehended, should unequivocally elicit a strong sense of shock, profound concern, and perhaps even outrage among the general populace and all those who are aware of the judicial proceedings. The sheer volume and consistent nature of these specific types of petitions underscore a deeply unsettling trend within the legal system, highlighting the persistent challenges and moral dilemmas faced by the judiciary when dealing with matters of national security and the rights of individuals associated with such grave offenses. The fact that the High Court is so frequently occupied with these cases involving terrorists and their families is a stark indicator of the ongoing struggle to balance justice, security, and human rights.
At the end of the day, the resources, the money, the capabilities are spent on things like making sure a terrorist isn't uncomfortable with the conditions in prison, or about the mattress he has, or the terrorist's mother who doesn't want her house demolished because her son went out and murdered Jews, and she gets support for that. She gets a salary from the State of Israel, but she doesn't want them to break a side window in her house, and that's why they appeal to the Supreme Court. All these things, in the end, you know, and there's the knock on the roof and all those issues of worrying about terrorists, and we see all this conduct happening even in the war itself, in real time. These things, I agree with the harsh statement you made, that the Supreme Court harms the security of the State of Israel.
Legal experts are sitting in the Supreme Court in the military system and basically putting spokes in the wheels, hindering the fighting, the decision-making of other commanders. I think Ofer Winter is one of the most successful and outstanding commanders the IDF has had. There is
a basis, but regarding international law, because it's one thing to say, are we allowed to fight the war? Just as it's right for our soldiers and the citizens of Israel to deal with international law, but in reality, many times there isn't even any real basis for this at all. We're up against a terrorist organization that does whatever it wants, and not only that,
we're talking about a combat zone, and this is a defensive war. I don't see any reason in the world why lawyers should dictate the moves to experienced, senior military personnel. I mean, I'm not saying ignore international law, but even in war, international law has its limits. And you can't just take international law and say, okay, now international law doesn't allow you, and that's it. No. You have to look at the whole picture, meaning you can't separate the context on the ground from international law. But still, and yet, we're talking here about a defensive war against brutal terrorist organizations, and we must not forget what they did to us on October 7th. Meaning, we're not going down the path of you took out my eye, so I'll take out both of yours. But still, we need to look at the whole picture and not disconnect it from the context of a combat situation, a war zone, and brutal terrorist organizations. And in fact, they declare, even today, after October 7th, they continue to declare that they want to destroy the State of Israel.
Say that all these legal matters ultimately tie our soldiers' hands, because you find yourself in a situation where you have to comply with some kind of international law. By the way, again, I'll put this in parentheses, a lot of things we call international law aren't necessarily the real thing. But you find yourself in a situation where you're up against a murderous terrorist organization that does whatever it wants, not bound by anything. And our legal experts are simply tying our soldiers' hands. They're living in a fantasy world.
This has been talked about a lot, and of course I agree with every word you said, and I think it's time for this legalism to simply disappear from the army, especially those people pulling the strings at the highest levels of the military legal system, who aren't necessarily acting out of pure motives. Unfortunately, political considerations have also infiltrated the army, and this is reflected in some bizarre decisions that are sometimes made by the military advocate general. And all of this is actually under the guise of, or with statements relating to international law, sometimes even citing laws that have simply been adopted but don't actually exist. And the enemies.
Our enemies use this, you know, even today, even though there was a sense at the beginning of the war that the hospital concept was no longer in play. The school concept was also gone, because we knew exactly that the terror organizations were operating underneath those places, but now we're back there again. We're back in that situation where we don't strike those places, unless there's special approval from a general, and only in very, very specific and particular cases, and our enemy takes advantage of that, takes advantage of our sensitivities in order to.
Just think, a soldier who wants to fire has to go through some process, through ranks and all that. We're talking about a time frame that can sometimes be extremely critical. I mean, look at the recent story about a house that collapsed on soldiers. Again, they reported it, they said, and then they were told, wait, no, there are non-combatants. Now, furthermore, I'm saying, again, if we're talking about international law, don't tell me that because it's a terrorist organization, it doesn't apply to them. What about our hostages? So wait, we're obligated to international law, while a murderous terrorist organization, which actually abuses and kills, even kills the hostages. We're talking about cases where they murdered hostages. So what are you expecting? meaning Israel should just stand by and accept every such thing just because there's international law.
But to wrap up, I want you to tell me, what do you think should be done as of today? The Israeli government, what decisions should it make so that things
will change? I'll speak only about the public sphere because when it comes to security and diplomacy, that's beyond me. But I think there needs to be a reform in the judicial system.
Do you think the state of Israel is capable right now of handling more significant changes in the judicial system?
You don't have to do it all at once. It can be done gradually. There are so many areas and issues in the legal system that need fixing. And I think if it's done in a gradual and thoughtful way, solutions can be found. The legal system includes the Supreme Court and the Judicial Appointments Committee. Does that include the state attorney's office? Of course. It's part of the legal and enforcement systems. But yes, and as for firing the Attorney General, I think she's failing in her role. She's acting against the law. She's conflicted up to her neck. Basically, she's not really the government's legal advisor. She's just the opposition. She's the opposition. She's a political figure opposing the government. And she serves the left's narrative. Let's call it what it is.
Attorney Zehava Gur, thank you very much for being with us. And thank you as well for being with us, supporting us, watching us, and standing by us.